And we're back with the next episode of FDA 101. Today, we're going to talk about the differences between the FDA and the European Medical Device Regulation. We'll talk a little bit about the differences and how they classify their products, but we're going to primarily focus on the audit methodology and style differences. So first off, last episode, we went into a lot of detail about FDA's product code and regulation structure, how it's all based on intended use and whatnot. Europe is entirely different. It is a rule-based classification system. It is not necessarily based on intended use, but it just walks you through, I think, 12 to 15 rules?
It's actually 22 classification rules.
Where they ask you questions and you kind of just keep going through each question until you end up at a decision point for, you could be class 1, you could be class 1 that is reusable, measuring, or sterile. That has a different type of approval process than just a class 1. So class 1 is self-certified. The class 1, whatever the letter is, you have to have a notified body for that. We'll talk about notified body in a minute. And then the notified body only has to look at the feature, the reuse, the sterile, or the measuring function. They're not looking at all of the product documentation. You could be class 2A, which is a low to moderate risk device, or you could be 2B, which is higher risk, but not quite to the level of the class 3, which typically are, similar to FDA in that they're life supporting or life sustaining. But we've also talked about products that they consider very high risk, like contacts and, different types of implants. Automatically class 3 in the European Union.
So under FDA, you have just kind of 1, 2, and 3, and technically unclassified, which we didn't talk about. And then under EU, it seems like there's a lot more buckets, if you will. You have the class 1s you talked about, and then the class 1s are even broken down into 1 sterile, 1 reusable, 1 measuring, and then class 2 is also an A and a B in class 3. So I'm counting 7 categories that you can classify under that classification scheme in Europe. So it is really quite different. And you mentioned notified bodies, which we talked about notified bodies in the 2 episodes ago. But let's talk about notified bodies versus FDA. What's kind of the difference? Are they both well, I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask the probing question to you, Michelle. How do they act differently, and how does industry interface with them differently? Notified body versus FDA.
Well, the first thing is that the FDA is a government entity, and it is the only government entity in which you can bring medical products to market. Because it's a government entity, it is a not-for-profit, theoretically, organization. Notified bodies are private businesses that are not government authorities that have been designated by what are called competent authorities, which is like each country in the European Union has at least 1 competent authority. So the competent authorities get together, they go audit these private businesses, and then they designate those notified bodies and it's not a blanket designation, it's very product specific. They can audit this type of product or this type of process. So in notified bodies, not only do you have exorbitant fees because they are for-profit businesses, but you also have that they're getting audited by their government bodies And so it's like a trickle down effect of, pressure, interpretation, not wanting to get asked questions by their competent authority. So they ask more of you than that they are really required or that you're required to give, just to try to avoid questions in their redesignation audits. So
Yeah.
those are two of the high level, but really big differences.
And I think it was really important, and you just touched on it briefly. With notified bodies, they get designated to do certain types of clearances or certain types of market approvals for products. So don't think that if you have a product that has, say, radiation, which is very niche, I have a lot of experience in it, that every notified body is going to actually be able to review your technical file and give you a CE mark to legally commercialize it, because the notified bodies themselves have to be qualified to review that type of technology. Whereas FDA, you know, is agnostic. All medical devices are under the purview of FDA. And while there are technically third-party review groups that FDA does work with to help speed up submission review times, ultimately, at the end of the day, FDA works primarily with industry. A government body works primarily with industry rather than notified bodies, who are kind of this middleman system. It used to make EU a quicker turnaround time in a sense, because you could kind of pay to play a little bit while you were waiting on your FDA clearances.
Mhm.
But as you heard our much lamented story about EU MDR and what's happening in Europe, that's really not the case anymore. And it is exorbitantly expensive.
Mhm.
We've covered some of that, but let's talk about audit differences, because I think this is fascinating. For companies who don't understand or don't know this and are thinking of getting into the medical device industry, knowing what's the expectation on audits and who audits, when audits might happen, is a big deal, because they're quite nerve-wracking when you're new to industry. You think you're doing everything right, and it still feels like a cop's driving a little too close behind you when an auditor comes. Um, and you kind of get like that, am I doing it all right? I kind of forgot everything I knew moment. So let's talk about audits, because there's different approaches and also different routine times that auditors will come. So let's start with the approaches. Michelle, tell us about the lovely QSIT.
Yep. So QSIT, or the quality system inspection technique, is the audit methodology that FDA uses in their inspection. It is system based, and it almost, if you were to draw it out, almost looks like a wagon wheel where everything is interconnected and everything connects back to management with executive responsibility. And it has this kind of question asking flow chart that has you gathering data in a particular subsystem, and then you get to like a stopping or a pausing point. It says, now take this data and information that you've gathered here and go look at this other system and see if the two are talking to each other and working interconnectedly. It's, to me, is a very effective inspection technique to get like right down to, do you have an issue or not, and is it systemic or not?
Yep.
Whereas, for an ISO 13485 certification, that is very much more of a checklist based approach. They have to cover every single clause in the standard. And to do that, it's very time consuming. So
Yeah.
that 1345 audit will last much longer than an FDA audit typically, even if there's nothing to find per se, because they have to fill out every single item on their checklist, not just move on, but like, I looked at this procedure, it said this, I looked at this record, it was in line. And so they have to tell like a little story, not just like good or no good, so.
And I find that QSIT has the strength of being better to find where your like your processes break down, where procedures don't feed into each other and they don't communicate. Whereas ISO, it almost feels a little bit more siloed because you are doing a huge swath of checkbox activities to make sure that, okay, this clause has been met, this
Mhm.
clause has been met, this clause has been met. And so depending on the duration, if you're prohibited, going a sufficient amount of time, you might not be able to look at the actual ways in an ISO audit how things are feeding into each other. But that's what makes audits meaningful.
Right.
It's hardly ever about the procedures. It's about the practice of your quality management
Exactly. Exactly.
and
Because
how
it's
you
easier
implement.
to get your procedures to say the right things
Yes.
versus getting the people to do the right things for the procedure.
And educating them on what that requirement can be. You know what I mean? Like we have the benefit of, decades of experience and and interpreting and reading things as they become new and understanding between the lines what that means. Whereas like a layperson who might work on the manufacturing line or who might even just do like, HR or something that's completely unrelated to product doesn't realize that they impact quality. So I find that QSIT kind of has this more process focused approach and
Mhm.
diving into the systems, and ISO can be a little bit more on the light side. There's a third elephant we haven't talked about, which is kind of a little bit in the middle, which is MDSAP, the Medical Device Single Audit Program. It follows its own audit model, and it's even more rigorous than ISO's in terms of extremely specific tasks that you check. And it is 7 chapters, very prescriptive audit. It's a very, very prescriptive audit that I find personally you can get lost in the weeds of answering just these limited questions rather than digging into the meat of seeing how processes interflow in the connectivity of a quality management
Mhm.
system as a whole.
Yeah. And they're task-based. And
Yeah.
again, and repetitive. So medical device single audit program made an effort at like trying to link tasks into different subsystems, but all they did was like end up adding like so many layers of redundancy because they would ask a question in a particular task, say in chapter 2, and then in chapter 5 they would repeat that question, but they wanted you to answer the same question. But now this time we're talking about that question, but the question task is under, say, design controls versus the question task under purchasing,
Yeah.
and like, so you just have to put on different hat to answer the same question. But they don't tell you that that's why the question's repeated. You just kind of,
Yeah, you have to kind of worm your way through it.
yep.
Um,
And so, we started talking about the QSIT at the beginning, and we have talked in other episodes about the QMSR quality management system regulation is coming February 2026 to replace the quality system regulation.
yep.
So notably about that, FDA still, this is July of 2025, still has not published what their audit methodology is going to be.
Yep.
Now, I have a hypothesis that they're going to accept MDSAP, or not accept, but adopt MDSAP as the formal inspection technique. And if they do, that will be sad to me because I don't feel like either MDSAP or standard 1345 audit really gets to the meat of the functionality of the
Yeah.
quality management system.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for us in industry, we're just speculating, but because MDSAP already, the United States is already a member of MDSAP and we can already, accept the reports in lieu of some audits, which we should talk about that. Um, in a minute here. I think it makes sense for them to adopt MDSAP. I think the struggle is FDA has announced for sure that QSIT will retire.
Mhm.
I mean, they published it in the notes to the comments to QMSR. that FDA is anticipating a retirement of the QSIT, and they will publish a new auditing procedure that they are going to be trained to and follow.
Mhm.
My personal guess is that they won't publish it until February 2nd, 2026 to avoid conflicting versions of requirements being publicly available. But who knows if that's really what's going to happen. That's just kind of my own suspicion that they don't want to have a conflict where we have a transition period. It's always hard for regulatory bodies to acknowledge transition periods because they want to hold both the future status and the current status accountable in the middle of the audit. Um, so yeah, be on your toes, be mindful of looking at that if you are in the FDA or looking at the FDA. QSIT from a practical standpoint is a great way to learn how to audit. It will be retiring. MDSAP might be where it is, but if if you're an auditor, you might feel the pain that Michelle and I have about the audit model itself because there are a lot of duplicate activities or activities that are kind of in weird chapters that don't make
Yeah,
sense.
and not value add,
It's
but
almost
time
like they
consuming.
wanted to have like that interlink back where you go back into other subsystems, but the way that they've structured hasn't quite achieved that goal. So hopefully the audit model will be revised to accept QMSR requirements, and maybe that will help solve some of those issues.
So we
Um,
talked about the MDSAP reports briefly. I think
yeah,
it's important for people to know is that just because you get an MDSAP certificate, that the FDA does not accept certificates. The audit organization sends FDA the entire audit report, and the FDA reads the entire audit report to make sure that they agree with the thoroughness and conclusions that was made in the audit organization's recommendations. So don't think, but, and so if they agree, they are unlikely to come and inspect you in person. Where they're likely, if you have an MDSAP certificate, is if you have some sort of adverse events or recalls, or there is a for cause reason um, for
or
them
if
to
you're a
come in.
high risk technology or a risk that they want to focus on.
Or new, like a pre-market approval if it's your first class 3 device and your other devices were class 2 or whatever. They will do a pre-approval inspection, and they only do that for class 3 devices.
So let's take a step back even further because let's talk about auditing schemes. So FDA has what's called unannounced audits, and they are typically routine, either routine, like your name just comes up on the list, or they are risk-based, and that is all of the reasons that you mentioned, where you kind of have, either complaints, recalls, adverse events, you're a high-risk product, or you're a technology that FDA has determined they want to focus on as seeing trends and issues in that industry. So they do unannounced audits, which is very different than other like EU MDR. So I mean, I have seen for class one audit companies, they won't get an audit for 5 to 7 years. And so you can just register and list your
If
device
ever.
and continue to sell with very little inspection from FDA, except for a handful of state FDAs that will come and audit, regularly if you are opening a new facility in that particular state. But in general, I would say a lot of class one companies don't get audits until they're several years in business. And I'd say even that's very similar for class two companies as well. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, what's your experience been with, class two, class one companies and the audit scheme in the US?
And I don't think I have ever seen anybody get audited for a class 1 product that was actually legally marketed. Now, there are some people that try to market under class 1 devices, and they actually exceed the expectation. Sometimes that will trigger the FDA. For class 2 devices, I've seen it all over the place. And a
Yeah.
lot of times there's things going on politically behind the scenes in FDA's thinking of changing regulations. And then they'll just go audit that type of company sometimes every year. Had a very low risk boil and bite mouthpiece for snoring FDA audited them every year for 5 years, even though they never got a 483. But we found out they were going into all the competitors and auditing them every year because they were trying to collect certain information. And what they did in the regulation was change that product to OTC from a prescription use. So
Yeah.
that was a really odd case. But then I've also seen it where there's class 2 devices that don't get audited by the FDA. It's supposed to be like kind of in theory every 2 years. I've not seen anything that is on a routine for 2 years. I see more like 5 years, 10 years, never. Like I have literally seen some class 2 companies that never have been inspected by the FDA.
I think this falls, similar with the experiences that I've had, even talking across the team and with ourselves, is either like they come every year consistently or they come never. And it's kind of like a feast and famine situation because it's all by an internal schedule that FDA sets. And it is, like you said, the companies that are getting hit every year are because almost of the technology that they're offering and not necessarily for other reasons. I mean, obviously there's risk-based, like there's cause for concerns audits. This is not what we're talking about. People who've had 483s and recalls and complaints, that's a different situation. But just unannounced routine audit inspections, it seems like it's feast or famine. And then it'll be a certain type of technology that's really popular. Like you said, the boil and bite mouth guard. I know menstrual cups, which were class 2 510(k) exempt, were particularly getting audited because I think that, when you have a class 2 product that's 510(k) exempt, there's no real oversight from the agency to enforce that industry is doing the right thing, the right testing and validations and design controls. And they were seeing that. And so they increased scrutiny on maybe that type of technology.
Let's talk briefly, like how does the inspection frequency differ with like a notified body or a ISO registrar?
Yeah, this is just what I was thinking of mentioning. So when you have a notified body or a registrar, big difference, registrar can only look at your quality management system. Notified body can actually do your technical file review and get you to market. If you are above a self-certified classification, just a little note. But as it's a for-profit model, it's very different because you will get audited every year. So when you initially approach EU and you want to get a notified body or a registrar quality management system certification, you start with a stage 1 audit, which basically establishes that all of your procedures are in place. And then a stage 2 audit usually occurs a couple months after that, and it's to review the records that you've generated after establishing that quality management system. So it's a little chicken and the egg where you have to have a quality management system and be using it to get your certification. And then once you get your whole quality system certified, FDA does not do this. Once you get a certificate, you're on a cycle after that. So every year you'll get what's called a surveillance audit. And every 3rd year you get what's called a recertification audit. And so after you've kind of done your initial qualification, you're stuck in a yearly audit cycle.
Mhm.
And the recertification audit tends to be more days and longer and more burdensome. So this is very expensive for companies, whereas FDA comes
And it's a
unannounced.
fixed expense as opposed to FDA is like first off, there's no expense, and you never know when they're going to come or if they're going to come. So you might want to just take your chances, if you will, with kind of self policing yourself through your internal audit program, rather than getting a certificate where for a fact it's going to be expensive, and you're going to have to dedicate not just the money but the internal resources every single year for it.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting place to be as a consumer, right? Like as someone who has many, many family members that are providers and use medical devices and work in healthcare, it's very interesting that FDA, by the nature of being a government agency directly, there's a lot less oversight than you would think for like class 1 companies. And even to an extent, class 2 companies, they don't require any quality management system review at all before you commercialize. You just have to have your pre-market clearance. If you're required to have a 510(k). The only time that's not true is if you have a PMA. You get what's called that pre-approval inspection, where they actually come in and make sure your design controls and manufacturing is up to snuff. But other than that, it's kind of a gamble of when they're going to come look at you. Whereas EU MDR, if you're commercializing in the EU, a notified body is already going to be working with you. And before they even look or consider any of your technical documentation, they're going to take a look at that quality management system and really make sure that it is already up to snuff long before you're selling any product. I'm talking months in advance. And you're in that surveillance
like 18
cycle.
months.
Yeah. And you're in that surveillance cycle paying for your audit certificate, and then you get stuck there.
Exactly.
MDSAP follows the same model. So you get your stage 1, stage 2 audit, and then you get certified, and then you go into the recertification cycle. The difference with MDSAP is if you have a US, if the US is in your scope, then you can do what Michelle was talking about earlier, where you can perhaps use the report to be accepted in lieu of a routine surveillance audit. That doesn't work for risk-based audits, but for routine ones, FDA may accept them.
Yeah. So those are the highlights of the differences between the types of audits and types of auditing bodies. So thanks for joining us, and tune in next time.
So next time we're going to be talking about, it'll be a little bit
regulatory rebels.
Yes, it's regulatory rebels. We're going to talk about what makes good regulatory personnel, and we're going to talk about proactive versus reactive compliance for companies. It's a little more strategic, a lot more nuanced, and maybe not quite so dry.
Yep. So let's end with a little quiz here. We've got 5 teams. So let's talk about vernacular. And so I don't know if we, in the last 2 episodes, if we very specifically touched on this or not. So you guys might have to go doing some little sleuthing on your own, but put the answer in the comments and we'll let you know if you get it right. But so 510(k), what is the right term? Clearance or approval? What about a PMA? What is the right term? Clearance or approval? And for a de novo, what do you get at the end of the de novo process? So think on those things. I hope you guys nailed it or were able to find it. And then we'll talk to you soon.
All right. See you in the next one.